But early this week, I thought maybe I will shift the topic, and I did. I changed the topic from the entry or triumphant entry of Jesus into the topic of hell. I think that'll set up Minister Chris for next week for preaching on the cross. But I switched the topic because I think it will do justice to the Gospels. Depending upon how you read some of the text, the topic of hell is near top of all the things that Jesus talks about. And D.A. Carson says that Jesus speaks more about hell, twice as much than heaven. And then John Piper writes that 13% of everything that Jesus says is about hell. And for myself, when I read the Gospels, three topics emerge. He talks about the kingdom. I think that's number one. He talks about money a lot, but he also talks about hell quite a bit. But rarely do we hear sermons on hell from the pulpit these days, and that would include me. This will be my first sermon on hell here at this church. Perhaps the topic is too depressing. It is a real downer, and it's kind of raining today, so it fits the mood. Perhaps it elicits guilt. I know it does for me every time I think about hell, the implications. But what if by not preaching on hell, the church is missing out? What if there is a power to contemplating about hell that awakens us to the spiritual life? And that's why I thought this morning it would be good to shift topic. Eric Weiner was scheduled to visit Bhutan for a British Broadcasting Company, that's BBC, and he had a story to do on happiness because Bhutan is the only country in the world that has a gross national happiness index. How are these people doing in terms of happiness, emotional health? Well, 91.2% say that they're deeply happy in this country. That means less than 10% are sad or depressed. Pretty good place to move to if you're sad. In his personal life, Eric needed this trip because even though his life was going well, he was suffering from panic attacks, shortness of breath, dizziness, numbness of feet and hands. Doctors could find nothing wrong. He felt like he was losing it. And so there he is sitting in the office of the director of the Center for Bhutan Studies, and he's spilling his gut out like a patient in a therapist's room. And the director, Kamar Yura, responds to the question, what can I do about this? With the unexpected answer, I think you need to think about dying, death, for 5 minutes every day. It will cure you. Well, after the initial shock, Eric realizes that there must be a connection between happiness and the advice that he has received in this country, because the people in Bhutan think about that 5 times a day, just like a Muslim would prostrate in prayer 5 times a day. Perhaps this is the reason why Bhutan is such a happy place. They regularly think about their own demise. Psychological research seems to confirm this. He points to a study by the University of Kentucky in 2007. They took a group of college students, divided them into 2 groups, had one think about going to the dentist, the other think about their own death, and then they provided them a sheet with a list of spaces with the first 2 letters filled in, like J-O or E-N, and then they were supposed to fill it in, make out words. And they found that those who thought about their own death wrote far more positive words than those who thought about going to the dentistry. Perhaps that says something about dentistry, I don't know. There's something about seeing yourself lying in your own grave that seems to awaken you to life. What Eric has learned and what the researchers at the University of Kentucky discovered, Charles Dickens turned it into a little novel, right? Every Christmas time. The Christmas Carol with its central character, Ebenezer Scrooge. The theme of the book, facing death, can awaken you to life. It can wither away all the distractions of one's life until only the essentials remain. This is the 9/11 effect. After 9/11, right? Spend time with family, relationships. Nothing like a brush with death for us to put first things first. Take risks. You truly live. That's why I want to ask the question, is thinking about hell similar in a spiritual life as it is thinking about death in the physical life? I mean, can there be similar benefits? We're thinking about how. If reflecting on physical death can awaken us to the vivid colors of being physically alive, right? We all want to take a drive. My wife and I this morning on the drive to church, where should we go to look at the colors change on the leaves? Perhaps thinking about how once in a while will awaken us to the joys of the spiritual life. Like a director of a 5-hour movie, you director, you get all the film in, he's got 5-6 hours of material, and what does he do? He needs to start cutting out all the distracting, irrelevant scenes until he has a nice, tight 2-hour story. Perhaps hell could have that effect for us. That our lives are all over the place. And perhaps thinking about how it's like director that starts cutting out that irrelevant scene, that distracting scene, until you have a nice, tight 2-hour story. Perhaps thinking about how it will make us sing more joyfully, be far more grateful for the cross than we are. Perhaps we are missing out by not talking about hell. I want to start with a very familiar passage this morning, and all of you know about it. And Peter asks Jesus, how many times should I forgive my brother? Up to 7 times. And Peter has been asking this question because if you know anything about Matthew, and I've been reading through Matthew for our Sunday school, one book of the Bible per week, I'm surprised at how many times forgiveness comes up throughout the story. And Peter realizes that relationships are very important to Jesus, that if you have something against your brother, before you come to worship, you go and settle it. And if someone has something against you, you don't leave it alone, you go to them. Sometimes it may require taking some of the leaders of the church, but relationships must be restored in the kingdom of God. Remember last week's sermon. The way of the cross is all about relationships. But Peter has a problem. How many times should I forgive my brother if he keeps sinning against me? So, Jesus offers one of those memorable parables. He said, look, think of a story where you have this servant who owes the most important person in the kingdom, right, the king, a huge amount of money, 10,000 talents. And then imagine that the servant comes before the throne and he's groveling, he's crying in agony in the marble floors, and he's begging for forgiveness, for compassion, and the king forgives him his debt. It's a gracious move. But then the story goes on that this individual has another brother, another servant, who owes him 100 denarii, and he chases him down and demands payment. And this guy gets on his knees, and he says the exact same thing that this servant said to the king, but there's no compassion. His heart is icy cold, and he casts this brother into debt prison. Now, I realize that everything that I just said, you already knew, right? I mean, how many sermons have you heard on this parable? You have learned nothing new, but I'm willing to bet that most sermons you heard stopped before the last 2 verses. The warning passage. For a number of reasons, perhaps. The preacher runs out of time. He's not comfortable with the topic. He doesn't quite know what to do, what it's saying, because the king taking back his forgiveness after he is forgiven, that's theologically messy. I'm not quite sure what to do with that. And this is true for myself. Do you know, and I don't think you'll remember, the very first sermon I ever preached at this church was about 2 years ago, right around late October, early November. Here in this pulpit, I preached on this passage. And I conveniently left out the last 2 verses. I mean, why in the world would I want to walk through this theological minefield in an interview process? Wait till you get hired. Then you talk about every controversial topic under the sun. Yeah, that's the wise thing to do. That's what I did. So we look at these 2 verses, and I'll read it again. And in anger, his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you. There are no exemptions. If you do not forgive your brother, let's just add a little bit more, from your heart. The difficulty with this text is not in its meaning. It's not that I don't understand what it's saying. I just don't like what it's saying. I mean, if I don't forgive others, then God's going to take back his forgiveness from me, and I'm in danger of going to hell. At least that's what the text seems to be saying. So, you look at the entire chapter of Matthew 18, and the whole chapter is about hell. So if you go to the next verse, thanks, Chris, if you could just keep forwarding it. If you go to the next verse, in the very beginning section, Matthew chapter 18, right? If anyone causes a little child to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and be drowned in the depth of the sea. That's the chapter 18, first scenario. Second one, if you are tempted by your eyes, pluck it out. If by your hands, cut it off. For it is better for you to enter life with one eye rather than with two eyes, to be thrown into the fire of hell. Third scenario, father longs for the 99 that are lost. He's going to leave for the one that's lost. He's going to leave the 99, go after the one. For he does not want any one of these little ones to perish. And then the fourth scene is our text this morning. The master would deliver him to the jailers until he should pay all of his debt. All four imageries. Casted into the deepest part of the sea, perishing, or being thrown into the hell of fire, and debtor's prison are all the same referent. It's all talking about hell. This chapter is about hell. In fact, this is not the first time that Jesus uses the imagery of debtor's prison with hell. So in the Sermon on the Mount, he says that if you wrong the fellow brother, go and reconcile with him, seek him out, lest he accuses you before a judge and sets you in prison. And then verse 26, truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. Same imagery. And then 4 verses earlier, if you wrong your brother by calling him a fool, you are liable to the hell of fire. It's the same connection in chapter 5 and chapter 18. These 2 verses are about hell. But what's more, the ESV translation is a little off. So if you've been looking, it says they translate the Greek term jailer, one of the Greek terms, and the ESV is softening it for you because it's not really jailer. The word is too soft. It's passive. As though this servant is placed in a prison and there's a jailer that's guarding it, and all he has to do is kill time. But the Greek term is far more active. He's not just guarding you, he's torturing you. Now you can see why the ESV softens it. The same Greek word is found in 3 passages. So if you look up on the screen in Matthew chapter 8, verse 29, 2 demon-possessed men encounter Jesus. They cry out to him, did you come to torment us? It's the same Greek word, to torment. Chapter 8, verse 6, the Roman centurion has a servant that's sick and he's asking Jesus to heal. And the servant is lying at home and he's in great pain. He's suffering terribly, chapter 8, verse 6. And then chapter 14, 24, the disciples are crossing the Sea of Galilee and the waves are beating against the boat. It's the same term. It's not a jailer, it's a tormentor. In fact, the NIV does it better. If you read the NIV of this verse, it says, in anger his master handed over him to the jailers to be tortured, and the NASB as well, over to the torturers. I'm not sure why the ESV softened it so much. Being tortured. Now, we want to be careful here. I do not think that hell is sort of spiritual waterboarding, a kind of hellish Guantanamo Bay. At least I don't want to believe it. I think the torment here is not so much physical as much as it is emotional. It's not like the medieval paintings with people, in fire and deep agony. But I do believe it is agony, but I think it is psychological. Because remember the context. The servant is judged for his unwillingness to forgive. So if the punishment is you don't forgive, the reason why they don't forgive is because they're unable to, because their heart is filled with such bitterness. A hardness of spirit that spews out acid against every person that has insulted you, excluded you, didn't invite you to the party, falsely blamed you, misunderstood you, cut you off on the road, who did not greet you, gossiped behind your back. And you can't forgive because you can't let go. And when you can't let go, it simmers. It corrodes. It destroys you from the inside. It is a lifetime of replaying the same words. I feel like it'll be watching the same movie of your own life. And every time you see the same scene of insult, you relive that emotional turmoil. You get so worked up. You can taste the vinegar in your mouth. Your gut gets so twisted that you can barely breathe. Your teeth so clenched. Your jaws locked. See, this is hell. And if you experience it long enough, it's no longer a matter of the will. You know, I choose not to forgive. If you say, I choose not to forgive long enough, it will come a time where you cannot forgive because you have become such a victim that you have been identified with the insult and the injustice. In fact, if you forgive, you no longer know who you are because it's such a part of you. You hang on to the miscarriage of justice for so long. You need it to identify yourself. This is hell. Stephen Covey tells a story of a husband and wife who goes for a divorce proceeding. I am told that divorce is one of the most contentious moments in a person's life because you're ripping apart a marital covenant. And all of the bitterness that you had suppressed over the years comes out in the proceedings, and it explodes. And the husband was required to hand over half of all the marital assets. And the court decided that it's better to liquidate all of the possessions, to split it in half. And so they gave the husband the responsibility of selling all of the marital assets for fair market value, and then he would hand over half the money to his wife. But he didn't want to hand over any money to his wife. His heart was filled with such rage that he decided that he would take his car, which was worth over $10,000 in 1980s, early 1980s dollar, and he sold it for $50 so that his ex-wife would only walk away with $25 from the transaction. He continued his version of suicidal bombing financially with their home, all the furniture inside, and all the valuables. In the end, he left his wife with a pittance of a settlement, barely enough to begin her own life. You can only imagine the bitterness to lose all of that cash for yourself because you just so want to strike. How many stories have you heard of a husband killing the children in order to get back at the spouse? That's how. Many of us are old enough that we may have gone through some version of this, a hatred that's so palatable you can taste it. It flavors all of your meals. I have stayed up at nights, cannot fall asleep because I'm reliving the pain and the anger. And then, you can't strike the person, so you strike at the people around you, usually your spouse, sometimes your kids, often my dog. And I wonder if the ungrateful servant went through something like this. You're sitting in prison, and what do you have? You have lots of time. What do you do with the time? You think about why you were there, and I'm thinking he is enraged, cuss words just spewing out because of the servants who ratted him out to the king. What do they think they're doing? It's not even their business. Why are they involved? And that stupid servant, all he had to do was have 100 denarii, and I won't be sitting in here. And what about the king? What kind of king? Cancels a debt and then uncancels it. That's not fair. That's unjust. And the more he relives it, the more enraged he becomes. Day after day after day. Some people want to argue that hell is like purgatory. Give it enough time and everyone will be vacated out. So Rob Bell wrote this book called Love Wins, and he says God will win the heart of every person living in hell until it is empty. And, I appreciate his motivation. I do, and I wish he was right. Who likes the doctrine of eternal damnation? But I have to disagree with his theology. Parable doesn't work that way. 10 10,000 talents is not a literal number that you can pay off. Jesus takes the largest unit of number, 10,000, and then he takes the largest denomination, that's a talent, and he puts it together. And his point is that if you owe an infinite amount, you need an infinite amount of time to pay it off. That's the point. The picture that comes closest to portraying how, for me, if you look at the screen, is Smeagol. If you've seen The Lord of the Rings, you see Smeagol, how he changes throughout the movie, barely recognizable, and he squatted in the blackness of a cave under a mountain. Barely a resemblance to the man he once was, and he's muttering, and he's blaming everyone for the state that he has ended up in, eternally bitter, eternally alone. This is hell. Perhaps we should think about hell a few moments every day. Not to be morbid, but just as a reminder that this is real. And when we do, I think two things will remind us, or two things will come up. First, it should awaken us to a responsibility that we as Christians have been placed in a very specific place. You, in the family, in your neighborhood, your job, your school, that God placed you right where you are because there's someone in your life that you are able to share the gospel with. That doesn't mean that you can't watch a football game or go on a vacation or do 100 other little things. What it does mean is that there is a criteria that evaluates what is important in life and what is not so important, so that throughout the day I understand where to put the emphasis and where not to. You know, my wife and I, on our 25th anniversary, we went to Paris and London. We still talk about it. It was the best vacation ever. We splurged. We didn't fight once. It was a great vacation. And we had a wonderful time. And in Paris, we went to the Louvre. Yeah, you got to visit the Louvre. And everyone kept telling us, wow, you got to be careful. When you go into the Louvre, it's so huge, you're going to get lost. And it's just amazing. And then it's mind-boggling. And I didn't realize how right they were until that day we visited the Louvre. 35,000 pieces of art work on display. First 15 minutes, we got lost. We ended up in Napoleon III's furniture. Napoleon III's apartment. They rebuilt in there, and then we got to see the furniture. And we didn't fly 8 hours to look at his furniture. And so I decided we needed a guide. So my wife and I, we spent 12 euros each, and along with 20 other people, we followed around a guide who led us from one piece to the next, just 7 pieces in an hour and a half. 7 pieces to explain, to teach, and we never got lost. We saw exactly what we did not even know we had to see. Among all the possibilities, 35,000 pieces of art, the guide boiled it down to just 7 and showed it to us. Perhaps reflecting on hell is something like that. There are 35,000 distractions throughout the day. Where to spend our time, what to do with our money, things we could be thinking about. Reflecting on hell is like a guide that boils it down to the 7 essentials that you gotta do. It doesn't mean that you can't walk down the aisle or the hallway and look at the royal jewelry. It means that you do first things first, and then you can go and relax. And I can't end this first point without a reminder, something that we all know, and I'm going to say it again, that it is our responsibility to share the gospel. Because yes, we are responsible for doing charitable work. Yes, we should be socially responsible. Allow Jesus to smell, or allow the smell of Jesus in our attitude to reach our neighbors, and this is all great. But unless at some point you speak the words, right? At some point you have to say the words. There's this debate on action versus deed, right? How much action, how much words. And we need action. We need to be gracious. We need to be outreaching and charitable. But at the end of the day, if you don't say it, how will they ever know why the church is reaching out? And I don't want to be overly dramatic or sensational, and every person who died yesterday without Christ is in hell today. Yeah, sometimes I'm watching the news, online news, and they have stories of people that die all the time. And if the thought regularly occurs to me, wow, that person is in hell right now. And I don't want to be overly dramatic, but I do believe it. I mean, theologically, that's what I believe. I just don't want to think about it. It's so easy to just switch channels or put on a Netflix movie. But if that's what we really believe, then it should start to affect the way that we live our life. This past week, a story came out of Philadelphia. Maybe you saw it online because it was an amazing story. That a man sexually harassed a woman and then raped her on a commuter train, not after midnight when no one was there, but between 9 and 10 p.m. And not for a few moments, but over 40 minutes, over a dozen stations, and not in an isolated car, but there were a number of people sitting there in seats nearby, and they had phones in their hands, and not one pulled that out and dialed 911. Instead, several of them lifted up to record what was occurring. Boy, what a world we live in. It was only after the train came to a station that a Metro employee standing outside on the platform looking into the train saw that something was not right, called the police, and in the very next stop, 3 minutes later, the police had already entered into that station, into the car, and had to pull the man off the woman. I think the parallels are pretty obvious, and I don't want to press it any more than I have to. Because guilt is a really rotten motivation for sharing the gospel. Who wants to be guilted? But sometimes I think we're confused guilt with conviction. Guilt is bad. Conviction is good. But perhaps the next point will help, because there's a second awakening to meditating on hell, and that's joy. For the thought of hell for us believers should bring forth the thought of heaven, right? Just as much as thinking about hell just sucks out the air out of your lungs, thinking about heaven should just flood you with the brilliance of a morning sun. If the picture of hell is Golem under a pitch black cave, then the picture of heaven, if you look at the screen, is when they come back from their journey into Rivendell and the reunion, and they're all laughing and they're dancing and they're sharing stories. I think that's one of the main things we're going to be doing in heaven, is sharing stories with each other, all under the soft lighting of a Kincaid painting. That's heaven. And Jesus speaks of this joy as well. You know, his disciples, sends them out 2 by 2 or 72, and they go out and they minister, and they come back and say, Lord, even demons are casted out in your name. We have never experienced such power, and people coming to know you, and ministry was exploding. Everything went so well. Sermons went viral. People's lives changed. And Jesus says in Luke chapter 10, if you look up, Luke chapter 10, nevertheless, do not rejoice in this. Don't rejoice that everything's going so well, that the spirits have subjected to you, but rejoice that your names are written in the book of life in heaven. Rejoice that no matter what happens to you today, there is a room in heaven reserved for you. John 14, Jesus has prepared a place, and your name is written on it. And no matter how your day goes today, your eternity is secure. All because Christ has gone to the utter ends of the earth, that Jesus descended into hell. This is Ephesians chapter 4, right? Paul says the Son of Man descended into the lower parts. That's how he went to hell, so that we do not have to go to hell. For he took our sins upon himself on the cross, and whosoever believeth in him, just trust him for your eternal destination. Your names will be written in the book of life. Perhaps hell is the key, that every time we think of hell, we should think of heaven. Every time we think of heaven, our hearts should be filled with joy, and out of that joyfulness, perhaps we should share the gospel with those around us. May God grant us joy and courage to speak out to those in our lives. In fact, just close your eyes for a moment. I'm done with this one. Just close your eyes for a moment. And I'm willing to bet after this message that the Spirit of God is just putting one face in your heart, or one name. All of us. And it may be in your workplace, in your neighborhood. It may be a family member. They may be living in China. They may be halfway across the world, but one face. And at the very least, to be able to offer a prayer, God, open their hearts. Let them hear the gospel. Help them to see the joy of being in Christ. If you could just lift up a prayer, just in a minute or so, and then I'm going to ask Jethro to bring you back with the last song.